Hello, my name is Peter Mark Bearward. I'm the head of migration architecture here at Google Cloud. And what I'd like to do today is talk to you a little bit about ways you can accelerate your migration towards the cloud. And what I'd like to do is just to start off by explaining how we view IT applications and where they reside, essentially in the world of migration. And so if you look at this chart, you can see that all applications really fall very broadly into these four quadrants, whether they're on the cloud or not, and greater or lesser degrees of modernization. And so when we think about where customers are going and where customers would want to be from the point of view of the cloud provider, we're hoping that everyone would like to be in that top quadrant with the highlighted green area. And we really think that that's actually the best location for applications to go, where they're the most efficient, where they're secure, where they have cost certainty and cost efficiency. And so we really do believe that that's the best place for applications to go. However, we recognize that in reality, most applications actually reside in that bottom left quadrant, where they still sit inside of data centers. They maybe haven't been modernized. They're using older architectural patterns, and they aren't, say, decoupled, they aren't highly efficient, not containerized, and so on. And in reality, most customer applications actually do sit there today. And so as a cloud provider, what we have to do is really come to where customers are today. And that's something that Google Cloud has really strived to do in the last couple of years, is not just say, here's this lofty goal of cloud and we hope you guys get there, but that actually we're going to be providing tools and methods and best practices to be able to go from this bottom left to the top right. And if you look at this chart, really there are essentially two paths from the bottom left to the top right. Either you can move over and modernize applications and refactor them and so on and leave them inside the data center and then move up to the cloud. Or you can move up from the data center into the cloud with relatively static applications that don't change too much in that transition, and then slowly transition them over to the right side as you modernize and refactor and rewrite applications. And so we feel that both of these routes are valid, and both of them have paths of success that you could do. However, today what we're going to do is focus on that the path where you go up and over first, because the reality is customers and customer applications are actually really everywhere on this quadrant. Very few people are sitting in just one quadrant. People have applications in data centers, moved applications out of data centers into the cloud, and move them over into the cloud. They've modernized inside the data center, and there's, generally speaking, a very widespread of applications everywhere. And so there are many, many paths of success in migration, and we're just going to focus on, just for today, on moving those applications that sit in data centers and moving them up into the cloud as they are. And so, kind of an open question to this audience here. If you've ever worked on a migration to the cloud from, say, a data center, what kind of challenges did you have? I'm sure there were many. And so I, along with many others here at Google Cloud who have worked on other migrations, sat down and kind of brainstormed what were the top 10 challenges that we came across. And we had a fairly obvious trend that came up, and that they were really cut in half by technical challenges and business challenges. Were really things that slowed down acceleration and lowered our chance of success. So if we go through these and we look at these business challenges, these mostly have to do with people and getting the right people and having the right people buy into the idea of a migration and really see that it's going to be successful for the company. And these are the kinds of problems that really, can't be solved by writing a script or an application or deploying some new version of something or other. This is really about people believing that the migration is the best thing for the company and that Google Cloud is the best place to go. And we've encountered these sort of situations, but these situations that you encounter, they really can slow down your migration. So if you look at things like, in particular, these first two bullets where maybe management doesn't believe 100% in the migration, that can really impede a lot of progress. Or if people are expecting the moon and really you're going into low orbit, for example, that can really slow down the pace of migration. Or in fact, when different groups have different ideas of what exactly the migration is supposed to accomplish. And so being clear about what you're trying to do and who needs to be involved and who needs to support this is so important for having a successful migration. And this is the kind of thing that as a provider, we can do quite a bit to help people convince senior management. We can work with different groups across your company to be able to describe the benefits of what a migration is and what Google Cloud can do. And there are also several programs that we offer from different groups within our company that actually try to address these situations upfront in a programmatic way. But at the end of the day, most of the business challenges are really about people rather than technical issues. On the other hand, there are always technical issues with any technical project. Of course, there are going to be technical issues, and we encounter these frequently as well. But it's important to recognize them for what they are so you can start preventing them from happening if you can as you start on your migration project, so that you don't encounter the issues that we've had, where we have had migration projects really slow down because of some things that maybe we didn't foresee at the time. So things like automation really speed up migration the more that you invest in automation. And so we've noticed that across customers that we've encountered, where the more automated customers are already and the more of an automation culture they have, the easier the migration becomes. And the more that you can do that before you migrate, the easier your migration will become. And I think the second point is actually probably one of the more important ones. We often get, say, the opposite reaction of people who are not enthusiastic. We get people who are extremely enthusiastic about migrating, which is fantastic. But then you come into a situation where they want to do absolutely everything all at once, and you get a bit of a feature creep situation where people just want to add more and more and more to this project, and it becomes kind of untenable, becomes undoable. And then instead of actually doing this grand ambitious effort, actually it gets all pulled back into, in the worst case scenario, nothing at all. And so there has to be some sort of limits on what is realistic to do in a particular time frame and what needs to be accomplished. We've gone into customers that have, for example, had, say, a very large MySQL backend database. They were really enthusiastic about not only moving to the cloud, but say, let's reconsider MySQL. Maybe we should move to a different kind of database. Maybe we should move to managed databases like Cloud SQL, or we should try a NoSQL database. Maybe we could shard out the data structure into different kinds of databases. We had to caution them against doing that during the migration. Said, look, we have a specific timeline to accomplish what you need to accomplish here. Let's get through that. And then after you're migrated, you can reconsider your design options and look at your database in a kind of calmer sort of atmosphere. And once they did that, they actually saw the benefit of doing that. And once the migration was finished, and it was finished successfully, then they took the time to actually examine what were their database needs in a way that didn't impact the migration. And they actually had a much more reasoned conversation among themselves about how to migrate that particular component. And so it's really important, if you've got a big enthusiasm buildup, which is fantastic, not to get too carried away. And so these technical challenges are things that we try to address with technical solutions, but they are things that you want to watch out for because they really do slow down, slow down migrations. And so when we look at what slows down or decelerates migrations, we also want to talk to you about what would accelerate a migration. We think this is where our best practices really come into play. And this is really what we want to focus on for the rest of this talk, about what accelerates your migration, about what moves it forward, about what can help you. And so these are best practices, again, gathered from different coworkers that I have and myself on the actual best practices that we have learned from working with customers. So this is something that is practical experience that we have seen in actually doing the act of migrating. And so I think the most important one, and this is what we're going to spend most of the time on, is building a proper cloud foundation. And we're going to go into that in quite a bit more detail, so I'm going to leave that for now. While you're building your cloud foundation and throughout your migration, the next most important thing to do is to actually think about security the whole time. So this is not something that you think about at the beginning. This is not something you think about at the end, but this is part of every single step of a migration. Otherwise, it's really just not going to work. You're going to have either people complaining, or you're going to have things that are not secure, or worst of both worlds. You're going to have both. And so it's very important to make that a consideration while you do your entire migration the whole time. As I said before, automation can really improve a migration. The more that you can do it, the faster and easier it can be. It's the difference between having to manually copy, say, an entire application or maybe an entire operating system from one location to another, verifying that the copy happened correctly, copying over data, making sure the tests run, making sure the application is connected the same way, versus just saying, no, I'm going to redeploy this application from one location to another. You're talking about the difference between hours versus minutes, or even days versus minutes, the more you can automate. And so everything you can do to automate your infrastructure and your environments is only going to help. Fourth, the more you can prepare for change and the more you can slice up your migration into manageable chunks, the easier it will be. So if you can build iteratively on your migration plan, if you can say these steps are going to happen and then build on those steps and just be prepared for one step to influence another step in a way that you didn't expect, you're going to be much better suited and better prepared for success. Rather than having 1, 2, 3 steps, maybe have like 1 through 20, 1 through 50, whatever it is, smaller, more manageable steps, and that way you can adjust as you go along. As you're making this migration, perhaps it's the first time you've done this and you really need to watch what you're doing and how you're getting there and how it's moving. So you really don't want to be too rigid in your plan. So be prepared for change and it'll work out pretty well. And then finally, once you're migrated, you're not really done. That's just the first step of actually existing on the cloud and having an application there. So really, you need to prepare for what we call day 2. So day 1 is this migration. Day 2 is this application now exists in a new environment. It needs to be managed. You need to monitor it. You need to log it. You need to audit it, redeploy new versions, and so on. So you need to prepare to manually operate this, not manually, but you need to actually operate this application as it exists in the cloud. And so you need to prepare for that as you migrate. Now, I said I was going to go back to what a cloud foundation is and how important this is in terms of a best practice. And so we're going to dive into that a little bit more. And so creating a cloud foundation is really about creating the location where your applications are going to migrate before you migrate a single application. And the reason this is so important is that if you can properly migrate into an already created and already vetted and already secure or already properly built out foundation, it's going to make the migration significantly easier. Rather than trying to do that as you migrate your applications, very much kind of like trying to build a plane while you're trying to fly the plane. You really want to have this foundation set before the first migration happens. And then once that migration happens, you don't have to think about all these parts of the foundation that exist. You can just keep on migrating applications, learning what's unique about your application, about your company, about your setup, rather than having to figure out what is unique about this cloud environment that you're moving to, which is really what you're figuring out when you establish your cloud foundation. So if we look at the first one, it's really, this is not, say, rocket science. It kind of makes sense that the first thing you should do is pick the first application that you want to move. But picking that application can be very difficult, and it can be non-intuitive or maybe perhaps not even obvious if you haven't done this before. So the characteristics of, say, a good mover is something that is not going to bring the business down if it doesn't work. On the other hand, it can't be so far out of the relevancy of the business that it's not going to be important if it does move. So you want things that are still a working application, a business application, something that matters. It's not a POC. It's not just a throwaway application. It is something real, but it is not something that is going to break the application or break your business, I beg your pardon. But you still have to learn from it. You still have to have some sort of knowledge gained from it. And also, you have to be able to control it. So if it's a license that you don't control, if there's particular hardware or software that connects to it that you can't control, that's not something that's going to make a good first mover. And if you look at the technical characteristics, they're similar in theme. You don't want something that's so tied to the rest of the business from a technical standpoint that it's going to be hard to untangle. You don't want something that's so intertwined with software licenses it's going to be difficult to move. You want something that can cleanly move on its own as easily as possible, rather than something that's really wound up inside of many, many other things. And so if we look at, say, an example application where we have users and external applications connecting to a website and a mobile application, there's a logging system, there's blog posts and so on, some sort of, say, customer commentary system, for example. It could be a lot of things. And if we look at this whole system, what would be a good first mover? For example, this mobile application. doesn't really depend on much of the rest of the application stack. It's got pretty simple inputs and outputs, and it can be pulled out and put in a different application location fairly easily. And so this would make a pretty good example of a first mover. On the other hand, bad first movers are pretty much the opposite of everything else we suggested. Things that are deeply entangled with the rest of the application stack, licenses that don't lend themselves to being migrated, things that are either far too business critical to move first, or things that are so irrelevant that they don't really prove anything. Edge cases that are, again, so far out there that they're not going to be relevant for the rest of your application base don't particularly make good first movers. And so if we look again at the same application stack, this blog post pool that kind of sits in the middle of everything would be really difficult to move first. It's got so many connections to everything else, so many dependencies on data in an upstream and downstream systems. It would just be so much more challenging than picking a different application. So it would be a much more difficult application to move first. Next, you want to establish an identity on the cloud. So people are going to be using your cloud environment, your users, your developers, operations, and so on. You need to establish who those people are and how they are going to get access and what those identities actually mean. And as far as Google Cloud is concerned, we have different identities, which are either people, their groups, or their service accounts. So they are automated systems acting in certain ways, and they become identities. And those, those become roles, and those roles have permission to act on certain services. And so you've got a great deal of granularity and flexibility in how you want to set that up in order to do pretty much anything you need to do in the cloud. And so if you look at the types of identities that we have in the cloud, you've got actual people, human accounts versus service accounts, which are not human. Those are robotic accounts, automated accounts, however you would like to describe them. You have groups, and then finally domains. And these are all the different ways that identity comes together in the cloud. And the really key thing here that I would like you to take away from this is that there are a couple of ways of setting this up. And we try to be as flexible as we can in order to meet you where you are. If you don't have a current identity system, then you can set that up in the cloud. You can set that up with Google Cloud. Or if you already have an existing one, then you can synchronize that with the cloud, and so that it maintains your existing identity structure. But the point is that we want to meet you with what you need and what you have today. Third, organizing your resources is critical. So once you have decided what is going to move, you've decided who are your people and what are their roles going to be in the cloud, deciding how you're going to organize your cloud is very important. In Google Cloud, you can have an organization with a number of folders underneath it. Within these folders, you can add projects. And the projects actually hold the resources, things like virtual machines, databases, queues, and so on. And so there's a layering of organization that you can add. And how you decide to do this really depends on your organizational preferences. I mean, we have a number of ideas and suggestions, but it's really going to depend on what suits your company best. So if we take a look at, say, maybe the simplest way of organizing a company, you have an organization at the top, then you have folders for environments, and then applications underneath. The great thing about this is it's fairly simple, it's intuitive, does not get complicated very soon. On the downside, this is not something that lends itself to flexibility. If you have environments that don't quite fit in here, or if you have things like shared services, you have no acknowledgement of the different divisions within a company. So if you take a slightly more complicated view, you could say, let's organize at a second level by function. So you have applications, you have shared services, and then underneath relatively similar structure. And so the downside is you're getting a little more complicated. The upside is you've got a little more flexibility in terms of adding shared services, recognizing that there are different functions of applications, so you can add that. And then finally, if we look at, say, maybe the most complex recommendation that we start with, you're actually dividing up applications by division before you get down to function or environment. And the upside of this is you get fantastic flexibility. You can really define and describe your organization in Google Cloud the way it actually is reflected in reality. The downside is that it is much more complicated to manage. It's much more complicated even to visualize and conceptualize. And crossing different project barriers and different folder barriers may in fact be more difficult. But it's all going to depend on the plus and minus of what you want and what works best for you. And so there are different ways of doing that. We're capable of supporting whatever those are, but it's important for you to decide what works best for you. Next, once you have this foundation created, so you've created or you've selected your first mover already, you've decided who your people are going to be when they're in their cloud, decided what that organization is going to look like, and then next you actually need to group those individuals and resources together so that you can figure out who's going to do what, when, how, to whomever. So this is an example grouping that we could recommend for a group starting out in the cloud. And the first one, you want to have a group that's going to define and control how your organization is defined and what permissions you're going to give to everyone. Where is everyone going to go? What is going to be at the top level? What are the things that you're going to decide to do? And so this group is only going to decide what things are and what things can be within the organization. Ideally, they're going to decide very little else. So you want to have separation of duties as clearly as possible. Next, you could have a network administration group. And this group, as you may assume, is going to define how the network works. They're going to define what kind of networks you're going to use, where are the firewalls, who's going to have access to what, how are you going to make connections between different projects, different networks, cloud to data center, and so on. And they're going to decide that. And once again, you're going to want to have a narrow focus on that. So that is all that that group is responsible for. Same idea with security, where you're going to have security group or security administrator group define what is permissible for the different roles, what is permissible with the different networks, what is permissible, say, from a virtual machine, and that is the sole focus of what they are going to do. And then finally, say, actually a very common grouping is actually billing. So people who are responsible for how the company gets billed, how the individual divisions within the company are going to get charged back based on the total cloud bill and so on. And that is their sole focus. And that is a set of permissions that you can sequester off from everything else, where they're only looking at how the bills come in, where they're coming from, who is charging what, and who's spending so much. And these are really just getting started recommendations. There's a lot more flexibility and a lot more granularity that you could add over time, but these are strong recommendations that we have up front. And then finally, the last step of building out this foundation is really defining your network. So you have a first mover, you have people and identities, you have an organization structure, you have groupings for permissions and roles and responsibilities. And finally, you need to really define the network that these applications are going to live in, and what your network wants to be and what you need it to be for your company and for your applications to succeed. So the first thing you need to decide is how you're going to connect to Google. So if you have existing infrastructure already, you're going to have to pick some kind of connectivity option up front, whether that's going over the public internet, whether that's going over carrier peering, so partnering with some of our partners to be able to create lease lines over carriers, or directly peering with Google ourselves. And so these options are all available to you. They have greater or lesser degrees of cost and speed. So it really depends on what you need and how long you need it for. None of these options have to last forever. So something you could start with going over the public internet, creating a VPN, or you can move to direct peering over time and then scale that back down. It really depends on what you need and how long you need it for. So if you look at some of these different options, if you look at, say, going over the public internet and peering at an ISP, if you look at the on the left-hand side here, you're getting on your side, you've got an SLA between yourself and the peering equipment at the ISP, and you've got capacity management between the ISP and a Google peering location. Meanwhile, if you do direct peering, you're actually directly peering with Google at an exchange room in a data center or something like that, in a peering location with us. And so you're cutting out actually a lot more steps in between, and you've got more direct connectivity. You can pay for higher bandwidth to be able to enable that as well. And once you've got connectivity to Google, you've got to decide, what is your network going to look like? What regions are you going to use? Are you going to be localized to, say, a region that's closest to you? Are you going to use multiple regions? Are you going to use all regions? Google networks span all regions by default, and so you've got to decide in terms of operations, where are you going to choose to deploy applications and where are you going to choose to deploy virtual machines? And how do you connect these different networks if you have multiple networks? So a strategy we've seen for many, many years has been a hub and spoke, where you've got, at the hub, you've got shared services, and out in the spokes, you've got the different application, different environments that can connect into the shared services and still have separation of concerns out in the spokes, where you're connecting between the hub and spoke over a VPN, or if you're doing network peering. Google has also introduced what we call shared VPC networks, where you have a single VPC, a single network that is, say, administered by the network administration group, and other projects have permission to launch resources within specific subnets in that group, inside that network. And so this is a different way of doing shared services that doesn't involve peering, it doesn't involve VPNs. If you need to have shared services, if you need to have still separation of concern and separation of ownership of resources, but you want applications still deployed within the same network. And so we've seen customers have a lot of success with this. And so this is the end of my recommendations. This is the end of the 5 steps of a cloud foundation. Again, these are kind of built out over time and experience of what we have done with customers, but we strongly recommend that really building out that foundation is going to lead you to so much more success and actually have a better chance of moving your migrations forward more quickly by doing this, for lack of a better term, homework up front. If you really build that out, if you take the time to invest in what this needs to be, then you're going to have a great deal more success. So thank you, and we're going to have questions in just a few minutes, so please stick around. Hello, welcome back. Thank you for these questions. I'm sure there are plenty more. What we'll try to do afterwards is get to those questions and answer them offline, but we've selected 6 here that seem to touch on a few similar concepts and questions. So I'm going to go through those and hopefully answer what you've asked me here. This first question, what open source tools can help with automation? There are a lot, and it really kind of depends on what point in your deployment pipeline you're talking about. But you have everything from right at the beginning to right at the very end. So I'm going to run through just a few. So if you look at software that helps you with your continuous integration side of things, you've got a lot of things that plug into Jenkins. So Jenkins is really kind of fantastic controller for that side of the pipeline where you're integrating different points of, say, deployment, say, code that's committed to Git or kind of wherever you keep your code, and being able to package that up, being able to run integration tests, unit tests, whatever those are, and then deploying that out as well, and integrating along that along that side from Jenkins into something like, say, using configuration tools like Chef and Puppet and so on, really actually make it fairly easy to have a situation where you have a developer that can commit to a shared repository for whatever project. Jenkins knows that new things have come in, can run integration tests, and then deploy that via, say, Chef or whatever you would like to use, and be able to deploy that onto virtual machines. And you can integrate all that with, say, a cloud-native environment configuration tool like Deployment Manager, or an open source equivalent, something like Terraform, where you've got Terraform or Deployment Manager managing the actual resources, and something like Chef and Puppet managing the configuration of your applications on those resources. If you want to use containers, then certainly things like Kubernetes, which is open source. I mean, it was created at Google, but it is definitely open source. Is a great container management orchestration tool. Seems to be fairly popular these days. And so, if you are using containers, then you want to have a container orchestration tool also managing that. Second question, how to encourage a culture of automation to accelerate migration? That's actually a fantastic question. I actually firmly believe that automation is one of the best ways to accelerate migration, and so this is really important. I think one of the things to do is that to sell IT and development on the idea that automation doesn't just help migration. It helps developers no matter where they're deploying to. It helps IT, it helps operations, it helps security, because you can basically take all these steps that are potentially manual at this point and codify them. You can put them into code, you can commit them, you can audit them, you can look at them, you can see what the processes are, what the procedures are, to be able to improve them, to be able to see what is actually done. And you're taking all this operational overhead off of people who are doing this manually. And so there are huge benefits well beyond migration. And one of the other nice things about automation is actually it's not an all or nothing proposition. You don't go from a completely manually deployed pipeline to a fully automated one in one step. There are baby steps you can take all along the way, and these incremental baby steps have huge benefits at every single step. If all you want to do is move to, say, automated configuration management with, say, Ansible, then do that and you will see huge benefits. Even if you're not fully automated down further up the pipeline, you're still going to get a lot of benefit. Or from the other side, if you just want to implement Jenkins so that every time you commit to your repository, you're running some tests, that has huge benefits right there already. And so I think the two-pronged approach towards going to a culture of automation is, one, everyone needs to understand this is not just for migration. It benefits day-to-day operations of all of IT. And two, baby steps are hugely beneficial. You don't have to do all or nothing to be able to really benefit from automation. Third question, what is the best way to get started with a migration? I think you've got to have a reason. So why do you want to move? If you're in a data center, are you capacity constrained? Are you not happy with your current equipment? Is upgrading the equipment going to be too expensive? Are you at an end of a lease? Is there a reason why wherever you are currently deployed is not working well? Because that's often a great motivating factor. On the other hand, is there something in particular about moving to Google Cloud that is particularly enticing? Is there something very interesting about, say, machine learning or using Kubernetes on Google Cloud that is particularly enticing? So I think getting a good reason for why you want to migrate is absolutely important. And so once you have that reason, this is the thing that kind of overcomes those business challenges that I was talking about earlier, about motivating people and getting people convinced that this is the best thing to do for your company is the best way to get started. And so really finding that motivating reason and getting out there and pushing people to be able to start that migration is a good way to start. Next question. What resources are available from Google and Google's partners to assist with our migration? So I'll speak about us first. We have tools that are available, things like, say, data transfer tools. So you can send us data offline. You can use data transfer tools to transfer data from kind of wherever it sits into, say, Google Cloud Storage. You can work with us on like VM migration, where we have a VM migration tool. We also have, like I said, programs. So things like if you work with our professional services team, they have several migration programs that can help you move forward. And so those are kind of the defined specifically for migration tools that you can use from us. In addition to that, working with Google account teams and so on will certainly enable those migrations. They'll help you out in kind of whatever way and connect you into the various different groups at Google that could help you with that. In terms of our partners, we have a lot of technical partners like, say, Cloud Endure or Velastrada that are all kind of geared towards automating migrations and migration tooling. Attunity works on data migration. So we have a few of those. We work with large partners that will come in and assist you kind of in terms of human resources, moving your applications, moving your data, and we partner with a lot of those. And so you can go everywhere from looking at, say, our resources online and reading up documentation to implementing our tools, working with us, working with partners, or any kind of combination thereof. And we do that fairly frequently. I've done that many, many times myself. Everything from only working with Googlers to only working with partners, and like I said, everything in between. Question 5. Does the shared VPC project apply to both public and private subnets? For private subnets, what's the model for accessing the resource? So the first question, yeah. In a shared VPC, you can make public and private subnets. It's really very much dependent on kind of what sort of shared VPC you want. It's under the control of that the admin for that shared VPC. If you want all the subnets to be private, you can do that. Want none of them, some sort of mix, you can do that. For private subnets, what's the model for accessing the resource? I'm not entirely sure I get the question, but I'll try to answer it. The way shared VPCs work is that there is a project that owns the VPC, the shared VPC, and it gives permission out to other projects to launch resources within that VPC within a subnet. And so if you've decided that this subnet is going to be a private subnet and that project A has permission to launch resources, launch VMs within that subnet, it's going to be able to have total control over that. And then the network admin, so the admin of the shared VPC, is going to determine how the different subnets are allowed to interact with each other, whether they're going to be totally firewalled off, whether they're going to have some access between each other, or if it's going to be completely open. It's going to be determined by that network admin. And then finally, I guess this is kind of related. Please clarify the shared VPC network so you can touch on that once more. So like I said, a shared VPC is a VPC owned by a particular project. It's administered by a particular project. The idea being, though, that that project is not going to launch any resources itself. It is a way to collect network administration within a single project and be able to distribute that network out to different projects that can then launch resources. And so the scenario that this is built for, and we've seen this with quite a few customers, is that network administrators need to control what happens to the network, but development teams are relatively autonomous and own the resources that they deploy. Shoot, beg your pardon. So I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. And so when the deployment team or the development team deploys resources, they want to be able to own that and be able to control that and be able to say, this is what we want to do and this is not what we want to do with our resources. But also, we don't want to administer our own network. We want the network admin team to be able to handle that. We just want to be able to control our own resources. And so that is kind of the goal and the idealized situation of what a shared VPC is used for. There are actually a lot more use cases for that. In particular for shared services is where it comes up a lot. But the case being, most of the time it's when teams own the resources, when they own the applications, where they own the services that are deployed, but do not want to or should not own the actual network administration is really what it's geared for. And that is it for our questions. And so thank you very much. Thank you for joining me. And next session is coming up shortly. Thank you very much.